What actually happens when someone accuses another person of having privilege? I'd say there's a couple possibilities. If you're an experienced player of this particular game and you want to signal that you belong, you may respond by acknowledging or checking your privilege. You might say something like, I've seen a lot of privileges in my life for such and such. A non-exhaustive list of things to acknowledge or apologize for would be white privilege, male privilege, heterosexual privilege, ableist privilege, binary gender privilege, cis privilege, socioeconomic privilege, native speaker privilege, singleton privilege, nativist privilege, neurotypical privilege, monogamous privilege, Christian privilege, socially acceptable body size privilege, height privilege. Be aware that there's no actual cap on the potential number of privileges, and that when and if any society actually reforms to correct for these privileges, new inequalities and new privileges would inevitably reform. But we'll get back to that at another time. Now, another possibility in this situation is to get mad. After all, the person accusing you is ultimately saying you didn't earn the things that you have. Whether you've worked for them or not, you actually received them because of privilege. And when the person lecturing you is on their 6th year of university on their father's dime, to someone from a working class, this is pretty clearly an insult. It's almost as if these concepts were designed to cause social unrest. But designed by who? See, this contemporary politicized usage of the term privilege didn't come out of nowhere. It shares a genealogy with other Marxist terms, specifically false consciousness and class consciousness. False consciousness, so faced with the reality that the workers in the developed countries had not yet united to murder business owners and political leaders in order to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat as Marx had predicted, Engels wrote that workers suffered a state of ignorance called false consciousness. And instead of becoming woke, paying attention, or achieving class consciousness, that is, the knowledge of their place in the class struggle as outlined by Marxist theory, workers were deluded by the dominant ideology of the ruling class. And if you want to see further developments of this kind of ideology and rhetoric, Gramsci's ideas on cultural hegemony would see how this is further elaborated by the Marxists. Now, the philosopher Karl Popper really took Marx to task, and specifically Marxists. Marx at one point said, what was the quote? He said, he was looking at the group, one of the first groups calling themselves Marxists, and he said something along the lines of, I don't know what I am then, but I most certainly am not a Marxist. Take that as you will. But Karl Popper took the Marxists to task in his work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He pointed out that this notion of false consciousness is an untestable and unverifiable hypothesis. It fails the verifiability test, and that makes it a prime example of pseudoscience because it is unprovable. So a brief example how this false consciousness and these kinds of terms play out in the real world is someone says socialism doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z. They may respond with any of the following. The American poor think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. You are suffering from false consciousness. Or, as a privileged person, you could never possibly understand the problems that face those of us who are marginalized. You really need to educate yourself. Or, since you are a member of a protected minority group and I can't get away with calling you privileged, you must be suffering from internalized oppression. Now, there are large-scale and elaborate theoretical justifications for these terms, but I want you to watch out for the simple versions of these exchanges that actually take place. This is what is actually happening at the ground level, and here's our chance to do real sociology. As Popper pointed out, there's simply no way to pierce this bubble and when every criticism can be met by undermining your opponent's very consciousness, then there is no way to falsify this belief with evidence. What's more disturbing is that Marxists, much like cult leaders, seem to have hacked into a kind of security flaw in the human mind, what cognitive therapists call cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are specific kinds of recurring, irrational thoughts. Notice I say that they're irrational and therefore disprovable. Mind reading is believing that you know what other people think. Nearly all humans have a module and a mechanism that allows us to model and predict what other people are thinking based on physical expression, facial expression, verbal cues, even socioeconomic status. We use these clues to construct a kind of map of the people we interact with, and we get an impression of what kind of person is acting behind the face that we're looking at. Mind reading got its name in cognitive therapy when researchers observed the behavior of certain New Age cultists who believed that they were actually reading the minds of other people. This belief was so strong that they claimed to hear the thoughts of other people as a kind of internal monologue. When someone accuses you of false consciousness, privilege, internalized oppression, not being woke, they are saying they know what you are thinking better than you do. Not only that, they are saying they understand why you are thinking that way better than you do. Cults use these techniques to break down individuality and undermine your subjective experience of the world in order to replace it with something else, a grand narrative. Black Lives Matter is a modern Marxist movement, and they are exhibiting the behavior of cultists.